subcortical regions of the brain that are important for control of movement. Include the basal nuclei, and they have names that you know, the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. Right? In this cartoon, we're also seeing the thalamus, which is an important part of the motor program, motor system as well. We're going to see that in a minute. But this slide is focusing on the basal nuclei, caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus. There's the internal capsule. Thalamus. We've seen the thalamus before. Thalamus is an important relay and processing center for somatosensory, well, for sensory information. The lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus for visual. The medial geniculate nucleus, which I didn't ask you to learn, for auditory. Other parts of the thalamus for taste. Other parts of the thalamus for somatosensory. Not the thalamus for olfactory. It's the one that we don't use the thalamus for. In addition to all that sensory relay and processing, the thalamus is important for motor processing, for planning and processing of motor information. So the next slide is asking you, you've seen things like this before. In the past, we've played the game with people, pointing to a box and naming it. Let's not play that game. I recommend you do this as homework. You should be able to label the boxes. If you have questions when you're doing this as homework, let me know. Just to point out, here's the gray matter of the motor cortex, white matter of the motor cortex, internal capsule carrying that information, which is going to go into the medulla, cross over, and go down, 90% of it, go down the contralateral corticospinal tract. But in addition to the cortex, we've got the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus, etc. So I'm going to skip the next slide, which has the answers, but I will post the answers in the next 24 hours. Here's a cartoon of it. But this introduces another key player that wasn't shown in the previous slide. And that is the substantia nigra of the midbrain. What neurotransmitter do you associate the substantia nigra with? You learned this for the previous section. Anybody want to say again? Dopamine. Remember, dopaminergic neurons have their cell bodies in the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra, the dopaminergic output from the substantia nigra, is an essential part of the initiation of movement. So when I plan, I'm going to walk towards the computer. There are neurons in my substantia nigra that are activating neurons in my basal nuclei and thalamus that are telling my cortex, okay, get ready to move. My cortex is planning and planning that movement. And so there's a whole bunch of activity in my brain a few milliseconds before I actually start my motor program towards the computer. Planning and initiation. And here is a slide that I do not want you to focus on the details, but I do want you to know the names of the main players. The substantia nigra, input to the putamen, and the globus pallidus. From there, input into the thalamus. And then the thalamus processes and integrates and relays that information to the motor cortex. And then the output from the motor cortex is going to follow a path through the output from the motor cortex is going to follow a path through the internal capsule, crossing over in the medulla into the contralateral corticospinal tract. That's all part of the brain control of movement. Starts in the substantia nigra. Processing in the basal nuclei, thalamus, and then processing and planning in the motor cortex. Output from the motor cortex then runs the motor programs in the spinal cord. This slide is about Parkinson's disease. And it shows that in a normal person, there's this both excitatory and inhibitory processing that is normal movement. In someone with Parkinson's, there is degradation of this pathway, this dopaminergic pathway, degradation of this pathway, wrong processing, insufficient activation of the cortex, insufficient control of movement, and that's why there's the Parkinsonian rigidity. People with Parkinson's disease are kind of stuck. They don't walk right. Their motor programs are poorly controlled. But I'm not going to ask you to, we're not going to figure out all these arrows. Finally, let's talk about the cerebellum, just because it's beautiful. The cerebellum is essential for fine motor control and for balance. Remember, one of the main inputs to the brain from the vestibular apparatus was the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is integrating, the spinocerebellar tracts are integrating information about where the body is. The vestibulocerebellar tracts are integrating information about where the head is and balance. Am I falling? Am I standing upright? Am I falling? That information is integrated in the cerebellum. I don't want you to know what's on here. All I want you to see is that input from the cerebellum goes to the contralateral motor cortex, so that's part of the input, and output from the motor cortex goes to the contralateral cerebellum, and again, this is part of a, feedback information, right? So the motor cortex is talking to the cerebellum is talking to the motor cortex as part of fine-tuning and integrating information for balance and proprioception, fine control. I can chew gum and walk at the same time. I can snap my fingers and walk at the same time. I can do all kinds of complicated things because of the complexity of the control pathway. So that's it for the motor system. Now your challenge for the next slightly less than 48 hours is to integrate this information with the sensory systems, the basic principles that I've reviewed some of, and now the new information about the motor system, and to integrate that for the exam on Wednesday. I would like to point out that on Moodle, there is another file. Right now it does not have any answers. But it's got a boatload of problems. Ordering problems, tell me a story problem, tell me a different story problem, tell me a different story problems, name of things, name the long receptors, and name the short, name the systems that use short receptors, and then, a bunch of naming and short answer questions. Describe how olfactory receptors, only 350 of which can give us ability to detect 10,000 odors. Asking some short answer questions, some multiple choice questions, a whole bunch of clickers. Anyway, my recommendation is to use this PowerPoint to help you identify what stories and what information and what facts, along with the key concepts list and your PowerPoints and your notes, to reinforce the knowledge you need to do well on the exam. I'm happy to answer a question. I will post the answers to these questions today. But my recommendation is don't just read my answers. Do the questions first. See what you can generate. Then look at my answer and say, oh my God, I only got 10% of that. That's not very good. Learn what I wrote and then try it again from the blank. Don't just read my answers. That's generally not good enough. Write your own answers. And then check your answers against mine. It's a much better way to form knowledge that could be on the exam. I know, it's a ton of stuff. That's your challenge. And you've got 46 hours to do it. Don't spend all 46 hours. Remember, sleep. Sleep is an important part of the consolidation of memory. So do not shortchange your sleep because it will negatively impact your ability to form memory. I'm happy to answer questions. Brittany's got a scheduled thing tomorrow and can be scheduled individually if you email her. Other than that, I'll see you Wednesday morning here at the test.